right, welcome everybody. My name is Devin Lau, and I'm the Associate Director of Yale Center Beijing, and we are very happy today to host another talk in our ongoing lectures. For those of you that are unfamiliar, Yale Center Beijing is Yale's only university-wide center outside of New Haven that we've hosted over now 100 plus events online featuring different Yale professors, spanning everything from astronomy to art history to music to biology. And so we have another good friend of ours, Professor Emily Erikson, joining us here today, and joining us as well is Helen Heyang. So thank you all, and thank you for joining us today for a special book talk that is co-hosted by Shanghai People's Publishing House. They're the publisher of the Chinese translation of Professor Emily Erikson's book that we will be discussing today. And they've also generously provided 5 books as a reward for questions from the audience that were pre-selected beforehand based on the caliber of the questions. So thank you to the audience as well for submitting questions and for already engaging in this topic. I'm going to introduce our moderator. She obtained her PhD from the Department of Economics at George Mason University and her bachelor's and master's from the Department of Finance at Wuhan University. Her research is in economic history and new institutional economics, focusing on the comprador system in China's foreign trade in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the dual landowner system in late Qing China. Her research has been published in China Economic Review, and it brings together theoretical abstractions with historical Chinese institutions, as well as well-established theories in new institutional economics. So a fascinating discussion today, I'm sure, that'll span time and geography. And so without further ado, I will turn things over to Heyang.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent introduction. Hi, Emily. So we are pleased and happy to have you here at our book event. And Professor Emily Erikson is the author of this new book, Trade and Nation, How Companies and Politics Reshaped Economic Thought. And besides this book, Professor Erikson also has 2 other books that are being translated or having been translated into Chinese. So the Chinese audience can read all 3 books written by Professor Erikson in Chinese. Actually, let's start our conversation from a question about the relationship between the 3 books. So Emily, could you talk about the motivation of this research, of this book? The theme of this book is closely related to your earlier books about the rise of the big companies, trade, and the state. So how did your early research inspire the writing of this book? How did you build up your research projects as a series of research step by step? As you know, many Chinese socio-economic historians have several projects either completed or ongoing that are relatively independent from each other, probably because the original sources they use and archives available are separate, or the methodologies they use for treating the materials can vary across projects. And the integration of the research projects about various topics seems to be a challenge to some scholars and to even some experienced and mature scholars. So how did you manage to avoid this problem from the beginning of your career? I guess this is a question that many Chinese scholars are interested in.
First, let me just thank everyone for coming. So it's really wonderful to see so many, not faces, but windows. So it's really excellent. And I really appreciate the interest in the book. And I so appreciate you coming, Helen, and serving as interlocutors. Your work is so fascinating, and it's really great to have this opportunity to meet you. And also, I want to thank the Yale Center for Beijing for supporting my work and Devin in his great efforts to bridge this connection between the two settings is it's really important and great. So this is a great question. I can't actually say that I can really take credit for having plotted this out as a path for my research since my since my dissertation work. So it did evolve over time. So just for the audience, so the book here, Trade and Nation, is about how merchants in England in the 17th century tried to persuade the government to take certain sort of policy actions. And in the process, they began writing public pamphlets and books and sort of constructing different theories about trade. And and this actually laid the groundwork for the development of classical economics over time. So the connection to my previous book, which was about the English East India Company, it's a kind of expansion of its trade network, is that the principals and owners and all of these people, I noticed when I was researching the company, this strange sort of what seemed to me then to be kind of a coincidence, which was that so many of the people that were involved in the English East India Company were also somehow writing these really important seminal texts on mercantilist economics kind of theory. I mean, if it's a little bit of an anachronistic way of referring to it, but we could call it that at this point. So they're writing stuff about commerce that was fairly influential. And the more I kind of dug into it, the more it was like this strange phenomenon where everyone that was writing these early mercantilist texts seemed to have some kind of affiliation with the companies. I mean, and it goes forward, like Mill worked for the English East India Company. So it goes forward quite a bit, even past the kind of 17th century, which was my area of focus. So I just kind of started to think about what it was, and that made this link keep occurring. And I actually thought it was going to be the overseas trade, this like the logistical problem of handling overseas trade. But in fact, that didn't actually turn out to be the case. It was instead more about the political situation of merchants in England at the time. So it naturally evolved, I would say, out of the other project. It's the early modern, I would say, is a fertile area of inquiry across all nations. There's these moments where that's formative for institutions that then shape the trajectory of things for centuries to come. So there's a lot of things to explore there. But I would say what allowed me, I think, to make this connection was to be flexible also about the kind of the methods and the archival resource that I draw from. So if I have an interesting question, my goal is not to let the method sort of determine the question that I'm asking, but to go at the question with as many different methods as I can, deploy to kind of uncover what's going on. And if I don't feel absolutely comfortable with a method, then I look for a co-author, someone to work with. But I think that approach then, and I generally like multi-method approaches, gives me the kind of freedom to explore related territory that I would otherwise have to dive out somewhere else. Also, then looking for the archival materials that are going to answer the question, rather than going to the archive, finding an interesting data source, and then kind of formulating a question around that. Although I know it's I have to also say that it's relatively easier if there's a lot of historical material there to work with, and that sometimes it's not quite as possible to have that sort of a freedom if the archival materials are more scarce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you did mastered a variety of methodologies in the books. Yes, we can see that. The second question is about the merchant-state relationship And this question has been a focus in Chinese business history and economic history as well. It's many people, many scholars, historians, as well as public intellectuals have been joining debates about merchant-state relationship. So in your book, to describe the relationship between the state and commercial actors, you use the word courtship. And this is an romantic word. It's an interesting word with a romantic tone. And actually that was a bit surprising to me. And I guess many Chinese audience might find this romantic tone a bit surprising, just like me. So how did you decide to define the relationship in such a romantic tone? And could the British state-merchant relationship always be framed in the formation or evolution of a courtship, or was it a special phenomenon only at certain phases of history?
Well, so I'm guessing that the reason why it's surprising is the kind of well, romantic, but even maybe the positive connotation that comes along with the notion of courtship, where the relationship is often seen as much more negative and antagonistic over time. Mm-hmm. And that, I think that makes a lot of sense, you know, even in the English context. In fact, I wish I knew more, and I'd love to have a conversation more about the Chinese context. But what I was trying to evoke with courtship was there was sort of a dual sense of, one, that this was a dynamic, ongoing process of kind of negotiation. So, and I thought that captured it, a sort of a process of give and take, and also the idea of the courtship being, you know, evocative of the court itself. So the state, that it takes place in the like residence of the sovereign, that idea of courtly manners, these things, because it was this state merchant negotiation that was in some ways taking place in the court of the English sovereign at that time, is setting the sort of guidelines for it. So those were the reasons that I sort of settled on it. I did actually think about it quite a lot. And I was trying to think about how to really express the sort of central idea in a brief way. So maybe, I mean, Special wasn't quite as successful as I hoped. I thought I was looking at, I looked at a number of different books, like books that I thought were really powerful academic books, and to see, you know, how they kind of got their story across right away. My favorite one was Paul Starr's The Social Transformation of American Medicine. He has this amazing line at the very beginning. Is the dream of reason did not take into account, or did not take power into account. And it's it like sort of sets this narrative between the protagonist, you know, the dream, and the antagonist reason, and I wanted to kind of capture and condense things into something that some kind of a phrase that captured the large, like had set kind of a narrative that people could dig into. So that was what I was trying to do in any case in using that term, and what I had in the back of my mind.
Okay. Yeah. And in most of Chinese history works, the Chinese state merchant relationship has been depicted as a love-hate relationship. Sometimes they can be friendly with each other, very close, even perhaps sweet, but sometimes it's just a really bad, messy relationship. And yeah, and there are many interesting historical works about that, like the salt merchants and the state, and the merchant groups. If you are interested, I can recommend some books, Chinese history books to you about this topic. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. that would be great.
Okay.
I mean, it also, there were definitely negative aspects to the relationship between the merchants and the state in England. But in the 17th century, it was, I think I would say is, it certainly wasn't in any way violent or confrontational. It was, there was a lot of support that was constructed from, I mean, these were, the companies were chartered by the crown, so they were given royal privileges to certain areas of trade, and so there was quite a lot of cooperation that occurred in this era in particular, where they're kind of the states relying on them for certain actions that would otherwise kind of be in the domain of the state, like negotiating with foreign powers, and then the merchants are relying on the state for enforcing monopoly privileges, and so it's not that much of a negative. So in that sense, I don't think courtship was too much of a stretch.
Okay. So the next question is about the multiple roles of merchants. So you broke down the members of trade committees and councils and the authors network belonging to each occupational categories. So there were categories of noble, gentry, clergy, military, professional, and merchant. So did the categories have clear-cut differences? Could some members in one category have overlapping roles in the other categories? And did merchants have multiple identities or identity shift in societal changes? And there's actually a book titled William Patterson, The Merchant Statesman. I don't know if you are aware of this book. The whole title is William Patterson, The Merchant Statesman, the founder of the Bank of England, His Life and Trials. And this book was written by Sax Bannister in 1858. Patterson drafted the proposals and reasons for constituting a council of trade. It seems that these prominent figures whose identity crossed the border between politics and trade could fill the gap and facilitated the communications between politicians and merchants. So, so that's related to the earlier questions. So, did the categories you generated in the book have clear-cut differences?
So the categories that, there's the coding process, right? And then there's the categories that they exist in the real world. So the way that I coded the categories, there was no overlap. So in a sense, they're hierarchical. Nobles and gentry took precedence over other categories. So if someone also was a noble and invested in a company, they would still be categorized as a noble in the coding scheme. And I think that that's reflective of the way that the people would have perceived themselves in the world as well. So the merchants is potentially most, I mean, of these, the category that was actually the most diverse and kind of like residual was the professionals category. That's the one that is not, I don't think, entirely reflective of what people, how people thought of themselves in the social world of 17th century Britain. That, there's lawyers, there's writers, there's one person who is a calligrapher, that's kind of like the grab bag of these different categories. But the other, it was possible, of course, there's some instances in which merchants received titles, accumulated enough wealth that they were able to reach this level in which they were granted some sign of nobility about them, or married into noble families, or but I would say it's not that common. And so Patterson, serving on the Council or Committee of Trade, Now, that would have not put him automatically into, so that's the statesman, but merchants did serve on councils of trade. So I have the data on that also in the book. And they were, however, minority presence in these councils of trade, which were entirely dominated by the landed elite, who actually, didn't really know very much about trade, but were perfectly happy to kind of like tell the merchants what they should be doing. So in the coding scheme, again, this would not be enough. So serving on a council or committee of trade, it does incorporate the merchants into the offices of state, into the process of governance, but it certainly doesn't make them a noble, right? It doesn't make them gentry according to the social status rules of Britain at that time. So that's an entirely different thing. But it does give them a voice in government, but it never gave them a majority voice in government. And the merchants themselves always complained that they weren't being listened to on the council, that they didn't have enough merchants, that there should be a merchant council, not a council that was led by the noble or gentry, and that they just didn't have the respect of the government or an adequate voice in the process, even though they do appear. And from time to time, someone becomes more influential.
Yeah, I was curious about that question because in certain phases in Chinese history, there were systematic occupation or identity shift caused by economic reforms. So for example, the transition from central planning system to the market system gave rise to many merchants who used to work for the government and or state-owned enterprises. So their identities were changed from public servants to merchants. And also in the Republican period, in the early 20th century, also there were many identity shifts or multiple identities of the same person as government official and merchant. So from the Chinese perspective, so I propose that question, but we know relatively little background of that period. So I'm just curious. Yeah, thanks for that.
Well, I mean, the state is so much more powerful in the 20th century, right? I mean, in China, the state's very powerful, and just then any developed nation state is going to be capable of large scale shifts that the early modern, I mean, we're talking about the Tudors and the Stuarts, like these were not developed administrative states that were capable of like on their own creating large scale shifts in social organization. I mean, it's like what they can accomplish is definitely limited. So some things are changing slowly. That merchants are like making more money and therefore like sometimes can attain higher status, but it is a very incremental process. There's not this kind of centralized planning and actual ability to follow through on the kinds of changes that our organization implementation that the state might try to undertake. It's not really happening at the same way that it conceivably happens in the 20th century, 21st.
Sure, yeah, okay. Yeah, the next question is about the methodology you often use in the book, graphs and social network analysis. So you have mastered solid skills of network analysis. I also saw your tweets this morning, and I found some frontier research resources about social network analysis. So you seem to have been, you have been very enthusiastic in promoting that methodology. And I think many Chinese scholars, both sociologists and historians, are interested in social network analysis too. So in your book, Between Monopoly and Free Trade, the network visualization of the English companies' Eastern trade is very impressive. And the idea to have a column that presents the effect of the matched voyages removed from the network. This idea is fantastic. And I've been using your book for teaching in my for my business history course. And each time I talk about that chapter, private trade, in your book, I'm very excited. I'm very excited to introduce that methodology. So it's a rigorously designed method that isolates the effect of malfeasant private trading through a randomized matching mechanism. So, randomized matching is a very popular econometric methodology. So economists are especially interested in that, but you extend that methodology of randomized matching into social network graph analysis. I don't know if my understanding is correct, but I do think this is a very original contribution. Each time I talk about this, I get very excited, and I show that to my students. The 3 columns, how the difference was generated. So could you briefly introduce the development of the methodologies of social network analysis in socioeconomic history research in the United States? In recent decades, there have been some interesting Chinese history research projects that apply social network analysis to lineage relationships, networks of scholarly officials and bureaucrats. So I believe Chinese historians are also very interested in what is happening in the United States about this methodology.
Well, first, thank you so much, and it's so nice of you to notice that. And it was, it is hard to combine. Networks is a little bit more descriptive. It's all about interdependency, and so it's hard to think about kind of counterfactual models and treatment control and combine it with a method. So I really appreciate, so that it did take a lot of thought to come up with that idea. And I also have to give credit to the original paper, Peter Behrman and I came up with that together because we co-authored a paper on that. And also the other person that I want to give credit to, although I didn't actually talk about the problem with him, but I was learning statistical methods from him at the time, is Michael Sobel, who's quite a good statistician, especially for a sociologist, I would say, and very much involved in causal modeling. And so I think he created a context in which I was thinking about matching a lot. So that, yeah, I wish more people would do. I do think that that's a really good way of thinking about it, and that it can be incorporated. It's not that hard. It's just kind of like a bootstrapping method, and that more people could use it in network modeling. And I wish it had become or it had been picked up a little bit more, because I think it is valuable. So I really appreciate that. So with networks and networks specifically in historical settings or economic settings, I mean, what's happened, well, at least in the United States, we've gone through these different stages where, I mean, when I was in graduate school, I was taking social network analysis with Harrison White and Duncan Watts, Peter Behrman, and it was, no one knew. It was really interesting. It was while I was in graduate school, actually, that people began to understand what a social network was. So when I first would tell, people say, what are you studying? I said, well, I'm studying social networks. And they have no idea. And then the movie with Mark Zuckerberg, The Social Network, came out. And then after that, everyone was like, oh, social networks, that's fascinating. And so it was really interesting to kind of live through that transformation. But we went from, I would say, social network analysis to network science. This is kind of dominated by the development of clustering algorithms, Mark Newman, physicists doing work on different kinds of measures. And then now I would say everything's kind of like, there was a brief moment when then it was computational social science, but now it's all data science. And so everything in network science is kind of folded under the data science umbrella. Which is fair, I guess. I hope that social network science, I mean, in some ways, data science is sort of just like statistics with larger data sets and more computational power. So I hope that the unique benefits of social and contributions of social network analysis don't get lost in this transformation. It was, I mean, in terms of the advantages of social network analysis and historical work, that's something that I think at Columbia University in particular, there was a very strong kind of institutional commitment in the sociology department to developing a social network approach to historical processes. And that was a combination of, Chuck Tilley had this relational perspective, although he didn't do that much actual social network analysis, but he was very close also with Harrison White, who kind of brought social network analysis into the social sciences and did a lot of early math modeling that was hugely influential. And then Peter Behrman doing the historical network analysis, which he did on the English Civil War in his first book. And then you had David Stark, who was doing the more kind of economic sociology, social network analysis, but often looking at the post-Soviet Eastern Bloc area and sort of capitalist reintegration, this kind of thing. So that kind of morphed then into network science, and the historical aspect, I think, didn't take off in quite the way that it was hoped in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. And it's something that I think, yes, UC Berkeley has a very strong sociology department, and they're also, I mean, they've been like #1 for the past 20 years or something like that, maybe longer. I would say they don't do this particular combination of social network analysis and comparative historical work that was sort of not entirely unique, but not widely adopted outside of Columbia. Maybe University of Chicago had a little bit more of that combination of networks and history. UC Berkeley has other amazing strengths. And there is one, and Heather Haberman isn't there now, and she does historical work, archival work, and combines it with network methods, and has done some great work on charities and thrifts and things like that. So I think it's really important in terms of understanding historical processes, because network structure has an independent effect on social outcomes. You can have all the characteristics of people can be right for something like, revolution or collective action, but if they're not connected in the right way, then the outcome is different. So this, I would say, is this for the emergence of state power, consolidation of notions of race, ethnicity, social cohesion, economic transformation, economic development, all of these things, which, are processes that we can like or not like, but that we want to understand. All of those are independently affected by social network structure. So my argument, my pitch is usually, if we don't at least incorporate social network structure into our analysis, then we're missing, a really important sort of causal pathway that could be really confusing our understanding of what's going on if we don't take it into account. So it may not cause everything, it may not be the primary factor, but I think if we don't at least consider it as a hypothesis, then we're potentially really misunderstanding the causes and consequences of different moments in history.
Yeah, and actually a very particular, very special thing about Chinese sociology is that I think almost all sociologists can accept social network this concept easily because in Chinese society, 关系, connections, connection is so important. Everybody knows that. So I think that makes a good foundation for accepting the concept of social network. But the formal methodologies of social network analysis still needs to be introduced to historians systematically. I think there have been some interesting books and interesting works done by Chinese sociologists, but in social economic history, it's still in a early trial stage, I would say. Yeah. So yes, I hope I can help the experts in this field, or the experts who like to use this methodology to know more about this. Maybe after our conversation, there will be some posts to introduce this methodology to socioeconomic historians. Yeah, there are a lot of historical scenarios and events that are applicable for this methodology. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And next question is about the transformation of political economy in early modern era. And so your book recognizes the importance of merchant authorship to the growth of the English economic literature. So in persuading the political elites to adopt policies that benefited not only the tradesmen, but also the nation as a whole, the merchants employed abstract concepts and neutral and scientific investigation to interpret the real insights they obtained from business matters. So I wonder how the merchants obtained the knowledge and skills required for scientific investigations and abstract conceptualizations. How did they master these methodologies?
Well, so I mean, this is a really interesting question because, you know, the level of knowledge and expertise that is required for economic analysis at this point is very high, right? So, you know, I mean, training in economics departments, I'm always jealous as a sociologist, in fact, because I think the training in economics departments is excellent, you know, but in the 17th century, it was not, the level of expertise that we're talking about was something that was not quite as hard to come by, right? So in terms of what the merchants are learning, the skills and knowledge for scientific analysis, if we're thinking, you know, this is and maybe it was different in China, it could be very, very different, but this is the era in which William Petty introduced political arithmetic. And so the big innovation there, you know, was the average, like that, you know, so it's not like calculating the average is not that difficult, certainly not that difficult for merchants that are actually engaged in tabulation and on a regular basis in their business pursuits. So I mean, this is one of the things that's kind of interesting is it's not that these skills existed in academics. There was no department of economics. There was not even a department of political economy at that point. It was actually that the merchants were using skills that they learned in their trade and then incorporating it into this discourse. And then, you know, eventually that then migrated into the way that academics did the work. So the merchants, they had certainly more skills in arithmetic and, you know, the use of statistics, early use of statistics, than anyone that was currently sitting at a chair at Oxford or Cambridge had. I mean, logic and consistency in reasoning. Now, I don't think that they were quite as good at that. So, you know, there's a couple standouts, but I think what happened, or one way to think about it, is that the merchants sort of created this discourse that became interesting and compelling enough that that other people then that had a little bit more training in not in scientific analysis, because science at this time, again, science is sort of a new idea, right? This is also like, it's only 1630 when the Royal Society is founded. This is Francis Bacon is he's still alive at the beginning of the centuries. There's the Hart Libyans. So just the idea of applying empirical and practical knowledge is very new. And it's not really, oh, I realize, I'm sorry, people are asking questions, but I can't read it because it's in Chinese characters. So I just want to flag that in case it just came up, in case those are questions that we should be responding to. But so, okay, so scientific inquiry, it wasn't something that's coming from the universities. It's actually more of a kind of a groundswell. And there's a lot of the kind of gentlemanly dabbling occurring also, right? Like the Royal Society is composed of people that aren't really professional scientists. They're like landowners that are sort of spending time, observing ducks in specific ways or something like that. So it's kind of easier for these people to participate in a discourse that we would think about as academic, but really they're doing it for pretty grounded reasons, and they're drawing from an empirical base of knowledge that was kind of more useful in some ways. And then over time, someone like Locke steps in, and Locke is well trained and thinks about things in a quite logical and consistent fashion, and he makes some inroads and pushes things further. But I think the reason that happened is that the merchants were able to make a compelling enough case about trade and national benefit wealth outcomes that people began to be more interested in participating in this dialogue and discourse.
Yeah, actually in Chinese, in the Ming and Qing dynasties, Chinese merchants also wrote a lot of books of commerce. Maybe they are similar. They were similar with the British equivalent. They have British equivalents. They were about the pragmatic knowledge of trade and accounting, things like that. But I always wonder why political economy didn't appear in China, because there were also interesting a lot of good books about written by merchants about the practical the practices of trade and accounting. But why didn't this contribute to the rise of an independent discipline of political economy in China? And this is really bothering me, actually.
I think it makes sense. I mean, it's the same, I mean, my book and the argument that I make would imply that it's because of the particular relationship that the states and the merchants had, right? That there was no incentive for merchants to frame the problems of commerce or, specie flow in terms of national wealth and prosperity, and to make those arguments for in the public domain. So that would be like, it was the lack of those incentives, the lack of the lack of the possibility for persuading the state that made it that kind of work sort of superfluous, and so it doesn't appear. That would be the implication. So does it really fit the Chinese context? I would need to do more work, but I hope it's at least an interesting question to explore.
Yeah, maybe there were no public spheres described in your book in China. I mean, and that
would be a really that's a really important element.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And I guess the last of few questions. So so the post-pandemic transformation requires people to rethink about global development and economic growth. So is there room for today's businessmen or merchants to initiate and organize debates and publish articles based on their insights from real economic and business matters in the public sphere that may lead to a transformation of political economy in the new era? There has been many think tanks to promote a new version of political economy and things like that. I wonder if there's space for merchants or businessmen, today's businessmen, to participate in this.
I mean, I think so. I think so. I think, so it is also true, of course, now economics exists. And as we already discussed, the level of expertise that exists in economics departments and that's commanded by economists is very high, right? So it's a little hard in some sense for someone that doesn't have a PhD, for example, to kind of compete in terms of expertise or influence with someone that does. So it's a different context. It's not as though there's an absence of the thought that's being created at the time. Now it takes a little bit more to kind of get over that bar, I think, for the merchants or business people, but I do think that one of the lessons of the book is that there's information expertise within these corporations or companies that can have a positive impact on social development over time. And I think that that's something that is at least in the United States at this point, it's people do not look to corporations, businesses for positive influences. They tend to think of them as sort of evil, monolithic companies that are trying to get as much power and wealth as they can. But historically, I don't, there was a lot more sort of moral responsibility, I think, that was taken up by these corporations. And I think all society benefited from that. And I think that if we have higher expectations from, say, merchants, corporations, or business people in terms of what their contribution to society can be, they might start to fulfill those expectations. So I think that we should, and there's lots of knowledge, and wow, corporations, business takes up a lot of our society and sort of time, So I think that I think we should certainly make space for them to contribute, powerful and innovative ways of thinking about how to improve things for everyone. We should all be doing that.
Yeah, there's a similar negative sentiment against the businessmen, and it's very similar with the American trend in China in recent decades. I think maybe after the 2008 financial crisis. So yeah. So I guess maybe the Chinese businessman can contribute something if their things are set up. There's good institutions and expectations for them to contribute. And the last question, do you view yourself a historian of economic thoughts? What have your books contributed to history of economic thoughts, this small field in economics?
Well, so I mean, I couldn't say I'm a historian of I mean, I'm not really a historian, so I probably wouldn't refer to myself as a historian of economic thought, but I do have many friends that are historians of economic thought, if that makes sense. So I mean, I think of what I'm doing. I mean, economic thought is, I don't think anyone would be offended if I said it's a little moribund, right? It's not a completely lively, vibrant field right now. It's very small, and it's kind of been hashing over some of questions that are sort of similar over time. So if anything, I think it's been kind of trapped. I mean, actually, and I got this from a review of my book that I read recently. It is true. So, like, for example, historians of economic thought have pretty much been debating how to define mercantilism for the past, like 20 or more years, like at least a couple decades. So that seems like that's probably not a fruitful debate at this point, and we might want to move past it. And so I think that at least what I've done in this book is showed a possible path forward for the history of economic thought, where we can think not so much about, arguing over different definitions, but thinking about what's causing these kinds of changes over time. And hopefully it's not really a causal framework, but it's a lot closer to a causal framework than, just kind of like describing the narrative shifts as they go along. So. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we have some questions from the audience who are really who look forward to interacting with you. So some of them have posted questions in Chinese, and also the organizer has collected some questions from the audience yesterday. I think I got some of them, and I selected several questions. So let me ask you the questions from the audience. So one of them said, Professor, trade has played an important role in the formation of the modern world. For example, the Dutch Empire was once called a coachman on the sea. It is a typical early Western country that built its country by trade. So is trade a double-edged sword in the contemporary society, especially in the era of globalization? That is, if it goes well, it will benefit itself and its partners. But if it doesn't, it will endanger its own development interests.
I would say so. It seems like the connection maybe is just a little bit bad, so I just want to say that. So let me know if my connection gets bad. I mean, I think trade is a positive. So and I know that globalization has been cast negatively, but in my I mean, the expansion of trade has dramatically reduced inequality in the world across nations. So within nations, then there's been increases in inequality, but I would not pin that on the expansion of global trade. It's instead the kind of rules and regulations that govern the distribution of the returns from that global trade. So I think global trade is a positive, and I think it increases the resources that are available to all. I think global intercourse between nations is extremely important. Intellectual exchange is extremely important. I think we benefit so much from all of those different things, and I would not want to live in a world where I was not able to direct an exchange program that facilitated the development of an intellectual global community. I think it's just important in so many different dimensions. So I can see that there's some concern about like global commodity chains, there's like these supply chains become fragile at certain points, but it's possible. I think the answer is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, is more to kind of like fix these points of fragility and make it a little bit more robust. I think that would probably be a better answer. It's my thoughts on the matter anyways.
Okay, here's another question. So Professor, is there difference? Is there barriers? Are there barriers between history and sociology? What should be done during my undergraduate studies if I am interested in historical sociology?
So are the barriers, I mean, so I studied undergraduate, studied history as an undergraduate, and then I went into sociology as a graduate student. I don't think the barriers are very high. My suggestion would be to study sociology because you get some skills in sociology that you won't have access to in history, but to take as many sort of history classes as you can to sort of round it out. Hopefully you'll be in a sociology department where there's people that are doing comparative historical work, and you can also work with them. Comparative historical work, though, is an important component of sociology. It's sort of the longest standing area. I mean, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, they are kind of the founding fathers of sociology. They were all engaged in comparative historical work. So it's not fringe. It's something that's definitely at the center of the discipline, and it should hopefully be not too difficult to pursue. Of course, the characters of different departments vary somewhat.
Okay, thanks. And there's another one. Are there similarities or differences between politics and businessmen and women, as politics can be security-driven, operate within nationalistic parameters, yet there's cooperation and confrontation. Is the economic world similar? Does it transcend political differences, or do we see similar patterns play out?
Well, I suppose in the era that I've been writing about in the 17th century, this was the era of mercantilism. So the kind of slogan of that is power and plenty, and trade and nation, and went hand in hand. So the concerns of politics were the sort of framework through which people thought about commercial problems. So the kind of competition that existed between nations, and that exists between nations in terms of politics, was also thought to, the trade was thought of as a zero-sum game itself. Like, if we're going to be the best trading nation in the world, then that means that we've taken trade away from another country that would otherwise have that trade. And so it's like, just, there's pie and there's this much trade in the world, and we're going to divide it up in different ways. And whoever gets the biggest slice of pie gets the most trade, and the other people lose out. But, this is sort of one of the big contributions of Adam Smith is that it's not a pie, it expands. And so the more people that engage in trade, and the more division of labor there is, the more expertise, the resources expand. So trade is not a zero-sum game. It is something that it's more like the more you contribute, the better it is, the more people involved, right? So it's like something with externalities. The telephone's not very useful unless everyone has a telephone. Then it becomes extremely useful. Trade, it gets better the more people engage in it. So I think the logic, at times people have thought the logic is the same, and there is still this kind of sense of like competitiveness in trade, but I think we've learned the lesson over time, and I hope we still embrace it, that the world is better when all societies are flourishing for everyone.
Yeah. So here's another question. So Holland was one of the countries that established modern business models. Its business models influenced Western Europe and North America deeply, but it did not have big influences in East Europe. Was it because the inland countries were less impacted by new or fresh things?
So the question is hard. So the business model, do they mean the corporation or do they mean, I mean, so I could think that innovations are things like public debt, no, or like the representation in the government is like a Dutch thing pretty much. And then there's the companies also, of course, corporate charters, things. So they took off more in the West where I think it's a more complicated problem than just a culture of innovation kind of answer. So the most convincing, I mean, and for me, the question is not so much Eastern Europe. The question is in Asia, which had this like thriving, like incredibly sophisticated commercial world. Why were companies not adopted more early or adopted earlier? I always find that, what was it about why did the corporate form not kind of take off in Asia earlier? That's the historical puzzle that I've always been kind of interested in. But the work that I've been the most persuaded by is that it has actually to do with the small family size in Western Europe. So I mean, and I guess this is a sort of related to the Catholic Church. They wanted this nuclear family model, which kind of reduced the impact of large-scale kinship networks, which had organized most societies and for most of the world, and that the reduction of the operating family unit and the reduction of the importance of these kinship networks created a space where corporate forms could sort of take on the role that these other informal networks had kind of operated within. So instead of having kinship, patron-client relationship structuring, everything, the corporate form kind of emerged in this like, space of absence, and then turned out to be a very powerful form of organization. And so that's what I know about it at this point. It's not the work that I've actually done, but I'm just drawing from other people's work. So it seems like it actually has to do with family structure.
Okay, yeah. So let's take the last question from the chat window. In the Chinese-style historical narrative, many businessmen turned to desire for political power after they had great economic strength. Sometimes this is not the case in Western countries. So, Professor, what is the reason for this difference? How do Western businessmen influence and shape national policies through trade? And the person is from University of Melbourne. Thank you. Yeah. So.
Well, this is a difficult question. I mean, so why do businessmen not try? I mean, some do in the United States, of course, right? So some people make lots of money and then they go into politics, and I can think of Michael Bloomberg, for example, or Paul Rand, or so it's not that they don't, but there are also lots of career politicians in the United States, people that study law and then serve in, maybe it's actually about party politics. And now that I'm thinking about it, so if you have large functioning political parties and that there's, like a system of promotion within the parties, then working in business and then you're 60 and you're going to retire and then you want to suddenly be the nominee for the party, then you haven't actually paid your dues within this larger system. So I am thinking that's probably the difference there. I mean, you also, of course, like it is true that politics is difficult, I would say. I mean, governance is difficult. So knowing what the right policies are and how to produce your intended outcomes, it's not easy. Society is very complex, interdependent system. So for someone to come out of a business and then think that they understand the system of government, they probably don't. And they probably actually need a lot more experience and knowledge in the sphere of politics. So so I think that might also produce some resistance among the parties, right? They want people that are actually well versed in how the parties operate and what they're trying to do, and also the process and practice of governance. So Western businessmen influence and shape national policy. I mean, I was, through trade, they lobby the government, right? And then there's also things that are similar to councils of trade. There's where there's the government, the state calls upon businessmen to directly advise them in matters of trade and policy. They don't always adopt the ideas that the businessmen propose, but there is definitely a conversation. And I suppose also there's probably, it just makes me think of Elon Musk is constantly on Twitter, suggesting ridiculous things. I don't know if you would even get that information or follow it, but he does insert himself into political events in a way that's unhelpful. But so at this point, and he does it through Twitter, which he's also going to purchase. So strangely enough, it seems that businessmen can insert themselves into politics by using social media. I don't know does that happen in China? It seems like a crazy thing. It doesn't seem like a very organized way of getting advice and implementing it, but that seems to happen.
Yeah. Okay. So it's already almost 9:10, and so we're really grateful for having Professor Emily Erikson here to introduce her book and explain some very interesting questions in her research. And the other, we hope that we still have opportunities to talk about the other 2 books you have written. And I believe the Chinese readers will be interested in knowing all of your works, whole profile of them. And again, this is the Chinese edition of your book with the same, almost the same design, right, of the front page. And so due to time limits, we cannot exhaust all the questions from the audience, but we have really learned a lot, and we're really thankful for your explanations. And is there anything that you want to speak to your Chinese audience, Chinese readers,
Just thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope that you enjoyed the book, and it's a real pleasure. And thank you, Helen. Thank you so much for your amazing questions.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for a great conversation. And thank you, Helen, again for hosting. And thank you, Emily, for getting up nice and early for us. I can unmute everybody so that everybody can say thank you to you both personally, and then thank you everybody for joining us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.